The clock on the wall ticked slowly, filling the quiet house with its sound. Carlos sat at the table, staring at the painting on the wall, one his late wife had made years ago. It was a simple landscape, nothing that would impress an art critic. But to him, it meant the world. Pedro, his 7-year-old son, played quietly on the floor, glancing up at his father from time to time. Since his mother's passing, the house had lost its color. Meals were quick, laughter was rare, and every object held memories that hurt more than they comforted. The painting, though, was different. Carlos looked at it every day, as if he could still hear his wife's gentle voice in it. Pedro, young as he was, understood how important it was. He often saw quiet tears on his father's face when he remembered her. That day, however, the silence felt heavier. Bills were piling up on the table, open and unsettling. Carlos rubbed his tired face, searching for a way out that wasn't there. Money was tight, and the debts were growing faster than he could manage. Pedro, sensing the tension, came closer with innocent eyes and asked, "Dad, are you okay?" His voice was a gentle reminder that Carlos wasn't alone. Carlos forced a smile, trying to hide his worry. "It's okay, son, it's okay." But deep down, he knew he couldn't keep pretending forever. The weight of being the only one responsible for his son's life was overwhelming. And as he looked at the painting again, a difficult idea came to him. Maybe, if he sold it, he could ease their financial burden. He stood in front of the painting for a long time, as if apologizing to his wife for even considering it. Every time he thought of letting it go, it felt like his heart was being torn out. But reality was pressing in, and Pedro's well-being had to come first. Fighting back tears, Carlos made a decision he never thought he would. He would take the painting to the auction the following week. When Pedro saw his father take the painting off the wall, he frowned. "Dad, why are you taking Mom's painting down?" His young voice was filled with genuine worry and an innocence that broke Carlos's heart. He knelt down to his son's level and tried to explain. "We need money, son. Maybe someone else will want to buy it." But Pedro shook his head right away. "No, Dad, that's Mom's painting. She painted it for us, not for other people." Pedro's simple, honest words echoed in Carlos's mind like a warning. For a moment, he almost changed his mind, but desperation won over emotion. "I know, son, but sometimes we have to make hard choices," he replied, trying to hide the pain in his voice. Pedro hugged the painting tightly, as if protecting it with his whole body. Carlos watched in silence, torn between what felt right and what felt necessary. It was as if his son had inherited his mother's sensitivity, seeing the real value in something that could never be measured in money. Still, Carlos felt he had to go through with it. "I promise it's the last thing we'll ever ask of your mother," he said, trying to convince himself as much as his son. That night, the mood in the house remained gloomy. Carlos wrapped the painting in a cloth to protect it, while Pedro cried silently in his room, clinging to an old toy. The boy's sorrow cut right through his father's conscience, who wondered if he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. But necessity spoke louder. As the night wore on, Carlos stayed awake, looking at the wrapped painting. He felt the decision was tearing him apart, but he believed he had no other choice. Pedro, now asleep, still held the teddy bear his mother had sewn for him. And in that contrast of innocence and pain, father and son were unknowingly preparing for a turn of events that would change their lives forever. If you believe that the true value of things lies in love and not in money, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell now. Stories like this will touch your heart every week. The morning sun brought little hope to Carlos. He woke up with heavy eyes, as if he had carried the weight of the world all night. Pedro was still asleep, and for a moment the father watched his son breathing peacefully. It was for him that he had to keep going, for him that he made sacrifices he never thought he would. The painting, wrapped in a cloth, stood leaning against the wall, ready to be taken. With slow steps, Carlos prepared breakfast. Pedro appeared, still sleepy, but when he saw the painting leaning against the wall, he frowned again. "Dad, are you really taking Mom's painting?" The question felt like a direct blow to the heart. Carlos tried to smile, but his voice was choked up. "Yes, son. Today we have to try." Pedro looked down, resigned, but couldn't hide his sadness. As they ate in silence, Carlos remembered every detail of his wife painting that picture. The sunny afternoons on the porch, her smile as she mixed the colors, the care with which she brushed each stroke. It was as if every mark was an extension of her soul. Reliving these memories made him question if he was betraying her memory. Even so, reality left him no other options. After breakfast, he dressed in the best clothes he had, even though they were still too simple for the auction standards. Pedro, curious, insisted on going with him. Carlos thought about saying no, but deep down he knew his son wouldn't stay home. And maybe it was better that he came along, to understand what they were facing. The walk to the auction was a quiet one. Carlos carried the painting carefully, as if it were a fragile treasure. Pedro, holding his father's hand, watched everything around him, trying to hide his anxiety. The boy didn't say a word, but with every step, he seemed more worried about the fate of that memory of his mother. When they arrived at the luxurious building where the event was being held, Pedro's eyes widened. He had never seen so much wealth in one place. Men and women dressed in expensive clothes were coming and going, laughing with glasses of champagne in their hands. Carlos felt out of place, but he kept his posture straight. He was determined to face the situation, whatever it took.
At the reception, the painting was registered among the items to be presented. The attendant looked at the piece with disdain, but didn't say a word. Carlos felt the implicit judgment, but swallowed his pride. Pedro, watching closely, noticed how the employee looked at the painting and held his father's hand even tighter. Inside the hall, the contrast was even starker. The walls were adorned with works by famous artists, and the air was thick with the arrogance of the collectors. Carlos tried not to be intimidated, but he felt people's eyes on him and his modest clothing. Pedro, on the other hand, looked at everything with a child's curiosity, though his gaze kept returning to the painting with a mix of sadness and protectiveness. The auction began with valuable pieces being contested at exorbitant prices. Carlos watched the numbers rise and fall, feeling more and more out of place. When it was his painting's turn, a heavy silence fell over the room. The looks of disdain multiplied, and he felt his heart beat faster. At that moment, Pedro tugged on his father's sleeve and whispered, "Don't let them laugh at Mom, Dad." Carlos swallowed hard, feeling the weight of responsibility. He knew he was about to face not only the judgment of the wealthy, but also the biggest battle between reason and heart he had ever known. The auction hall felt like a world apart. Crystal chandeliers lit up the room, reflecting the wealth displayed everywhere. $1,000,000 paintings hung on the walls, and decorated tables served expensive drinks to the guests. The sound of elegant conversation filled the air, but there was also an atmosphere of superiority. Carlos and Pedro entered cautiously, like intruders in a territory that wasn't theirs. Pedro, his eyes wide, tried to take in every detail. He had never seen so much luxury in one place. To him, every gesture and every laugh from the attendees seemed to belong to another planet, far removed from his simple reality. Carlos, for his part, kept his posture straight, even as he felt people's eyes judging his modest clothing. He didn't want to show any weakness in the face of their silent judgment. As the first bids came one after another, Carlos watched the numbers skyrocket. Paintings that seemed ordinary to him were fought over as if they were priceless treasures. Each strike of the auctioneer's hammer felt like a cruel reminder that his wife had never been recognized in those elite circles. Pedro watched everything in silence, trying to understand why people would pay so much money for things they didn't truly know.
The contrast between their painting and the displayed works was evident. The wrapped canvas Carlos carried seemed like an intruder among pieces signed by famous names. The auctioneer, upon noticing the painting, gave it a cold, almost impatient look. It was as if he already knew it wouldn't bring much to the event. Carlos swallowed hard, but stood his ground. As they waited for their turn, a wave of uncertainty washed over Carlos. He remembered his wife painting by the window, laughing as she played with Pedro, mixing colors without a care for what they might be worth someday. His heart ached. He wondered if he was about to hand over this precious memory to people who would never understand what it truly meant. Pedro noticed his father's distress and squeezed his hand. "Are you nervous, Dad?" he asked quietly. Carlos forced a smile. "A little, son, but everything will be okay." Deep down, though, he didn't even believe it himself. The skeptical looks from the collectors and the air of disdain hanging in the room already hinted at what was to come. The conversations around them grew louder, filled with laughter and comments that Carlos pretended not to hear. He knew they were directed at him and his painting. Pedro, more innocent, didn't fully grasp the meanness behind those words, but he could tell they were being laughed at. The boy lowered his eyes, embarrassed by the hostile atmosphere. When the auctioneer announced that the next item was Carlos's painting, the hall fell into a different kind of silence. It wasn't one of anticipation, but of judgment. Many of the attendees frowned, while others stifled quiet laughs. Carlos felt a knot in his throat, but he walked to the front with the painting in his hands and placed it on the prepared easel. Pedro stared intently at the painting, as if he wanted to protect it from the cruel gazes in the room. To him, it wasn't an item for sale, but his last tangible memory of his mother. Carlos, however, felt that the audience saw nothing but amateurish work with no value. The auctioneer cleared his throat and opened the bidding, but no one seemed willing to raise their hand. The silence that followed was broken by snickers and whispers. Pedro held tightly to his father's arm, as if he could stop him from giving away something so sacred. The heavy atmosphere foreshadowed the humiliation that was about to unfold. Among the guests, one man stood out because of his imposing presence. Eduardo, a billionaire known for his extravagant art collection, watched the scene with disdain. He wore an impeccable suit and carried an expression of superiority. To him, every piece of art was just another trophy for his vast collection. His gaze toward Carlos's painting was pure contempt. Eduardo had already bought several pieces that evening, always offering exorbitant sums just to reaffirm his power. His presence dominated the room, and everyone seemed to respect him, or fear him. When he noticed the auctioneer's hesitation in front of the simple painting, an ironic smile appeared on his lips. It was clear he saw an opportunity to amuse himself at someone else's expense. Carlos held his ground, but he could feel Eduardo's gaze cutting through his confidence. Pedro, innocent, didn't yet understand who that man was, but he sensed that his presence made his father even more uncomfortable. The silence in the hall was broken when Eduardo slowly rose to his feet, drawing everyone's attention.
"And what is this?" he said loudly, pointing at the painting.
A school project? Or did someone forget to bring the real piece? Laughter spread through the room, stabbing at Carlos's heart. The auctioneer tried to maintain his composure, but he couldn't hide his embarrassment either. Pedro's eyes widened, frightened by the mockery. He didn't understand how anyone could laugh at something so special. Carlos, on the other hand, swallowed hard, trying to maintain his dignity. The memory of his wife kept him standing, but the shame in front of the crowd was unbearable. Eduardo, seeing the effect of his words, intensified his attack. "I won't offer a thing for this piece of junk," he exclaimed with sarcasm, drawing even louder laughter from the attendees. The sound echoed through the hall like a hammer, crushing any hope of respect. Carlos felt his eyes well up, but he refused to cry in front of them. His instinct was to accept any amount just to end the torture. Pedro, however, couldn't bear to see his father in that position. He held his hand even tighter, feeling the pain overflowing from his heart. The boy, small but sensitive, understood they were being humiliated, and in silence he began gathering the courage that would change everything. Eduardo sat back down, pleased with the crowd's reaction. For him, it was just another evening of amusement at someone else's expense. But without realizing it, his words had planted the seed of a revelation he never imagined he would face. Carlos, frozen, felt crushed by the pressure. Financial need pushed him one way, while love for his wife pulled him the other. The auction hall waited for his decision, and every second felt like an eternity. It was in that moment of awkward silence that Pedro's eyes shone with determination. The child knew he had to speak, and his innocent voice was about to cut through the arrogance like an invisible blade. The auctioneer tried once more to ask for bids on the painting. His voice sounded uncertain, as if he expected the rejection. "Would anyone like to start at 500?" The room remained silent, broken only by a few discreet coughs and muffled giggles. Carlos felt his face grow hot, as if he were exposed before a cruel audience. Pedro, standing beside his father, looked at the people with a confused expression. He didn't understand why they were laughing at something so special to them. To the boy, that painting was a part of his mother, a piece of her heart left behind. He couldn't comprehend how anyone failed to see that. Eduardo, noticing the discomfort, raised his voice again. "I'll pay 20 reais, just so this amateur piece doesn't ruin the evening." The comment provoked roaring laughter in the hall. Some even clapped mockingly, as if this cruelty were a separate show. Carlos lowered his head, feeling the humiliation burn inside him.
Every scornful word felt like a dagger twisting in his memory of his wife. He remembered her smile as she painted, the sparkle in her eyes when she showed him the finished canvas. Now, seeing that memory turned into a public joke was an almost unbearable pain. But even so, Carlos took a deep breath and prepared to accept. An awkward silence fell over the hall once more. Carlos looked at the auctioneer, almost ready to nod in agreement, to end this nightmare. The audience waited eagerly, hungry for the confirmation of this humble man's defeat. Pedro, however, never took his eyes off his father, seeing the internal struggle written on his face. The boy began to tremble, not from fear, but from indignation. His heart raced, as if sensing a decisive moment was at hand. His small hand squeezed his father's tightly, transmitting a silent energy. Carlos, in turn, felt that pressure and looked at his son. In those innocent eyes was something greater than words could express. Another guest's laughter echoed through the hall again, intensifying the feeling of humiliation. Pedro couldn't take it anymore. The adult's complicit silence, the cruel mockery, the disdain for his mother's love, it all made him burn inside. He knew he had to do something, even if he was just a child facing giants. Carlos, on the verge of giving in, murmured, "Son, maybe it's best to accept."
But before he could finish, Pedro took a deep breath, filling himself with courage. His tear-filled eyes lifted, and his voice, small but firm, began to rise from his chest. The hall, full of arrogance and indifference, was about to hear something that would completely change the course of that evening. A truth so simple and so pure that no amount of money could challenge it. And in that moment, while his father still hesitated, Pedro opened his mouth to speak. "Don't sell it, Dad." Pedro's voice echoed through the hall, surprising everyone. It was high-pitched, but it carried a strength that instantly silenced the laughter. The boy let go of his father's hand and took a step forward, facing the auctioneer and the crowd. The silence that followed was so intense that even the crystals in the chandelier seemed to be listening. "Don't sell it, Dad. Mom painted this with her heart. Mom's heart doesn't have a price. It only has love." The words came out with the purity of someone who speaks without fear, only with truth. Those short phrases cut through the arrogance like invisible arrows. The laughter turned to embarrassed faces, and even the whispers vanished. Carlos stood frozen, his heart filled with pride and pain at the same time. He wanted to hug his son, but he couldn't move. The weight of those words was greater than any gesture. He realized that, even without fully understanding, Pedro had grasped the painting's real value better than any adult in that room. Eduardo, who had been enjoying himself until then, felt an unexpected impact. The child's words struck an old wound, buried deep in his soul. He remembered his own mother, lost in his childhood. Suddenly, that painting, once an object of scorn, seemed to carry the weight of an absence he knew all too well. As they made their way toward the exit, a few people quietly stepped aside to let them pass. There was no applause, but the mockery was gone. This silent respect was proof that something had shifted. Carlos, however, wasn't looking for recognition. His only goal was to protect his wife's legacy and uphold his family's dignity. Outside, the cool night air seemed to return the peace they had lost. Carlos took a deep breath, feeling that despite the pain, he had made the right choice. Pedro, still holding his hand, looked at the painting with renewed tenderness. "Mom must be happy in heaven, right, Dad?" he asked softly. Carlos smiled, his emotions swelling. "Yes, son. She's very proud of you." The words came out heavy with tears, but also with relief. He felt that in that moment he had regained not only the memory of his wife, but also his own self-confidence. The walk home was quiet, but not heavy. It was a different kind of silence, filled with the certainty that they had won a battle of love against the world's arrogance. Carlos carried the painting like a sacred flame, and Pedro walked beside him with the innocence of one who had just taught the adults a lesson. As they disappeared into the dark streets, Eduardo, inside his limousine, watched from a distance. His face was somber, but his eyes were glistening. The boy's words had stirred memories he had tried to bury for years, and for the first time in a very long time, the billionaire felt vulnerable. The next morning, Carlos woke up exhausted, but lighter in his soul. The painting was back on the wall as if it had never left. He spent a few minutes looking at it, gently touching the frame. Pedro woke up soon after, and still sleepy, ran to hug his father. "We won, right, Dad?" he murmured. Carlos smiled, moved. "Yes, son, we won." They hadn't gained money, but they had preserved something infinitely more valuable. He knew the coming days would still be financially difficult, but the dignity they had reclaimed was a foundation no money could ever buy. As they had breakfast, Pedro couldn't stop talking about the previous night. "I was scared, Dad, but when I saw you almost selling it, I couldn't stay quiet. Mom wouldn't have wanted that." The boy's words touched Carlos deeply. He realized his son, so young, had an inner strength that inspired him. At that moment, Carlos made a silent promise. He would never again risk his wife's memory because of the world's pressures. He could face poverty, but he would never betray the memory of the one who had given him so much love. Pedro, with his pure voice, had shown him the right path to follow.
Meanwhile, in his luxurious apartment, Eduardo couldn't sleep. Pedro's words echoed in his mind like a ghost. He remembered his own mother, the nights he cried alone after her death, and how he had sought in wealth and collections a substitute that never materialized. For the first time in years, he felt empty in face of his fortune.
The room remained silent, but the energy had completely changed. The looks that were once full of mockery now shifted between discomfort and admiration for the boy's courage. Some people glanced away, ashamed of having laughed. Others stared at Pedro in surprise, unable to believe the firmness in his words. Carlos took a deep breath and made a decision. He turned to the auctioneer and said in a steady voice, "My son is right. This painting is not for sale." The auctioneer swallowed hard, clearly relieved that he didn't have to push forward with something that had become so uncomfortable. Eduardo, silent, bowed his head for a moment. The words echoed in his mind like a cruel reminder that all the money in the world hadn't filled the emptiness his mother left behind. For the first time in years, he had nothing to say. He rose slowly and, without looking at anyone, left the room quietly. Pedro ran to hug his father, and Carlos held him tightly, feeling an immense sense of relief. The painting, once about to be sold, now remained in their hands, protected by a child's courage. The atmosphere, once hostile, was now filled with a respectful silence. In that moment, Carlos realized he had won the most difficult battle, not betraying his wife's memory. And it was all thanks to Pedro's courage and pure love, which gave voice to what his father hadn't been strong enough to say.
After Eduardo's sudden departure, the room remained steeped in an awkward silence. The guests, who had been full of laughter and mockery just moments before, now avoided making eye contact. The cruel comment had lost its appeal, and everyone knew it. Carlos, holding Pedro in his arms, felt that their dignity had been restored, even though the wounds of humiliation remained open. The auctioneer, visibly uncomfortable, tried to get the event back on track. He called for the next item in a hurried voice, as if wanting to erase what had just happened. But the atmosphere was no longer the same. The impact of Pedro's words hung in every corner of the room, like a shadow that was impossible to ignore. Carlos took deep breaths, trying to calm his racing heart. He had decided he wouldn't sell the painting, no matter what it cost him. The image of his wife, alive in that canvas, was now more untouchable than ever. Pedro, clinging to his father, smiled through his tears. He knew he had protected his mother's memory, and that gave him a feeling of victory. A few guests whispered discreetly, no longer with laughter, but with a mix of guilt and reflection. There was something in the gesture of that child that had touched even the coldest people present. No one dared to laugh again, and even the sound of cutlery and glasses seemed quieter. Carlos decided it was time to leave. He carefully gathered the painting, holding it like a treasure, and prepared to leave the hall. Pedro walked beside him with his head held high, proud of his courage. For the first time that evening, he didn't seem like a frightened boy, but someone who had spoken for something greater than himself.
As they made their way toward the exit, a few people quietly stepped aside to let them pass. There was no applause, but the mockery was gone. This silent respect was proof that something had shifted. Carlos, however, wasn't looking for recognition. His only goal was to protect his wife's legacy and uphold his family's dignity. Outside, the cool night air seemed to return the peace they had lost. Carlos took a deep breath, feeling that despite the pain, he had made the right choice. Pedro, still holding his hand, looked at the painting with renewed tenderness. "Mom must be happy in heaven, right, Dad?" he asked softly. Carlos smiled, his emotions swelling. Yes, son. She's very proud of you. The words came out heavy with tears, but also with relief. He felt that in that moment he had regained not only the memory of his wife, but also his own self-confidence. The walk home was quiet, but not heavy. It was a different kind of silence, filled with the certainty that they had won a battle of love against the world's arrogance. Carlos carried the painting like a sacred flame, and Pedro walked beside him with the innocence of one who had just taught the adults a lesson. As they disappeared into the dark streets, Eduardo, inside his limousine, watched from a distance. His face was somber, but his eyes were glistening. The boy's words had stirred memories he had tried to bury for years, and for the first time in a very long time, the billionaire felt vulnerable. The next morning, Carlos woke up exhausted, but lighter in his soul. The painting was back on the wall as if it had never left. He spent a few minutes looking at it, gently touching the frame. Pedro woke up soon after, and still sleepy, ran to hug his father. "We won, right, Dad?" he murmured. Carlos smiled, moved. "Yes, son, we won." They hadn't gained money, but they had preserved something infinitely more valuable. He knew the coming days would still be financially difficult, but the dignity they had reclaimed was a foundation no money could ever buy. As they had breakfast, Pedro couldn't stop talking about the previous night. "I was scared, Dad, but when I saw you almost selling it, I couldn't stay quiet. Mom wouldn't have wanted that." The boy's words touched Carlos deeply. He realized his son, so young, had an inner strength that inspired him. At that moment, Carlos made a silent promise. He would never again risk his wife's memory because of the world's pressures. He could face poverty, but he would never betray the memory of the one who had given him so much love. Pedro, with his pure voice, had shown him the right path to follow. Meanwhile, in his luxurious apartment, Eduardo couldn't sleep. Pedro's words echoed in his mind like a ghost. He remembered his own mother, the nights he cried alone after her death, and how he had sought in wealth and collections a substitute that never materialized. For the first time in years, he felt empty in face of his fortune.
Eduardo walked through the hall of his art collection, looking at the incredibly expensive works he had acquired. They all seemed cold, lifeless, and meaningless to him now. None of them held the value that the humble painting had held for that little boy. "Love," he murmured to himself, feeling an old pain resurface. He felt restless the entire day. His usual arrogance had vanished, replaced by a deep sense of incompleteness. What that boy had said wasn't just a child's defense. It was a truth he himself had never had the courage to face. Nothing can replace a lost love. Meanwhile, Carlos spent the afternoon reorganizing things around the house. As he sorted through piles of overdue bills, he felt the temptation to blame himself again. But every time he looked at Pedro, running around the living room and smiling, he remembered he had made the right choice. His wife's love lived on, not just in the painting, but also in their son's heart. That night, before bed, Pedro hugged his father and said, "I think Mom spoke through me at the auction." Carlos smiled and stroked the boy's hair. "Yes, she did, son. It was her voice that you brought into the world." And with tears in his eyes, he fell asleep with the certainty that his wife's memory was safe. Meanwhile, Eduardo looked out the window of his penthouse, alone amidst all the luxury. He knew he needed to do something. For the first time, the billionaire was willing to listen to his heart and to seek a path that went beyond money. Eduardo stayed up all night, sitting in his leather armchair with a full glass of untouched wine beside him. His mind was fixed on the child's voice, echoing in his head. "Mom's heart doesn't have a price, it only has love." That phrase had stripped away all his masks and revealed the emptiness he had tried to cover up with his fortune.
He walked into the vast hall of his penthouse, where hundreds of million-dollar artworks were displayed. Every painting, every sculpture seemed to shout the same thing: coldness. None of them carried the warmth he had felt watching the boy defend his mother's memory. For the first time, Eduardo realized his collection was a graveyard of feelings with no soul. The memory of his own mother hit him like a blow. He remembered being a child, listening to her tell him bedtime stories in that sweet voice that lulled him to sleep. Her sudden death had left him orphaned not just of a mother, but of love itself. Since then, he had decided that money would be his armor. But now that armor felt useless against the words of a child. Meanwhile, Carlos was living a simple life, but with a lighter soul. The memory of the humiliation still stung, but Pedro's gesture had transformed that shame into pride. He knew he would still face hardships, but he didn't regret refusing the offer. The painting remained on the wall, lighting up their home like a beacon of hope. Pedro, innocent as ever, kept repeating the words he had spoken at the auction. For him, it had just been an act of love. He didn't yet understand the full depth of its impact. Carlos watched his son and felt that despite the pain of their loss, so much of his wife was still alive in that child.
Tormented, Eduardo searched for an answer. He tried to distract himself with meetings and business deals, but nothing worked. Pedro's smile, his courage in the face of adult arrogance, was an uncomfortable mirror. He realized it wasn't the boy who should feel ashamed, but himself, for having lost his humanity in his pursuit of power. Days passed, but the weight of that memory didn't fade. Eduardo no longer found pleasure in his million-dollar purchases or his luxuries. His mind was fixed on Carlos and Pedro, figures who represented something he had never been able to buy: authenticity, affection, and courage. Deep down, Eduardo knew he needed to do more than just reflect. That encounter couldn't end with the humiliation. If there was any meaning to the impact he had felt, it would be to use it to transform something in his own life. For the first time, the billionaire was thinking about making amends. And so, on a rainy morning, Eduardo made a decision. He would seek out Carlos and Pedro, not to offer empty apologies, but to offer something real. A path that could honor not only the memory of Carlos's wife, but also that of his own mother. While Eduardo was finalizing his decision, Carlos went about his modest routine, trying to keep up with the bills. The scene from the auction still stayed with him, but now as a reminder that he had made the right choice. Every time he looked at Pedro playing in the living room, he felt his wife was still alive there. On that particular evening, a luxury car pulled up discreetly on their simple street. Carlos, hearing a soft honk, glanced out the window and couldn't believe his eyes. Eduardo was stepping out of the vehicle, shielded by an elegant umbrella, but with a serious expression, a world away from the arrogance he had shown at the auction. Pedro ran to his father, curious. "Who is it, Dad?" Carlos took a moment to answer, still surprised. "It's that man, from the auction." The boy frowned, suspicious. His instinct told him this visitor wasn't welcome, but his childlike curiosity kept him watching. Eduardo approached slowly, without the air of superiority he usually carried. His steps were heavy, as if each one required courage. When he stopped in front of the door, he took a deep breath and said, "Carlos, I need to talk to you." His voice didn't sound authoritative, but rather heavy with emotion. Carlos hesitated for a moment, but opened the door. He was still hurt, but the billionaire's expression seemed sincere.
Pedro stayed by his father's side, staring at Eduardo with the seriousness of someone who had already faced his arrogance. "I came here because that night changed something in me," Eduardo began, with difficulty. "Your son's words made me remember my own mother. I realized that my entire collection, all my money, mean nothing compared to what you have: love and real memories."
Carlos remained silent, taking in every word. He didn't know if he could trust the man, but he felt that Eduardo wasn't there to humiliate them again. Pedro, curious, asked with simple directness, "Then why did you call Mom's painting trash?" The question completely disarmed the billionaire. Eduardo looked down, ashamed. "Because I was blind, Pedro. Because I forgot what truly matters." His voice caught for a moment, revealing the hidden pain. Carlos realized this wasn't the same man who had mocked them. Here was someone broken inside, searching for redemption. It was then that Eduardo made his proposal. "I want to start a community art foundation in your wife's name, Carlos, and I want you to run it. People need to understand the value of true art, the kind that comes from the heart." Carlos and Pedro looked at each other, surprised. This unexpected offer didn't erase the pain of the humiliation, but it opened a door to a different future. And for the first time, Eduardo seemed sincere in his search for something beyond money. After his conversation with Carlos, Eduardo returned to his penthouse in silence. The city glittered under the nightlights, but to him it seemed empty. The luxury surrounding him no longer had the same effect. The echo of Pedro's words still vibrated in his mind, bringing back memories of a childhood marked by love and loss. He opened a bottle of wine, but didn't even take a sip. He walked among the pieces in his collection, seeing them with different eyes. Before, each piece was a symbol of conquest and power. Now, everything seemed soulless. $1,000,000 paintings offered him no warmth. Rare sculptures didn't fill his emptiness. Every detail in the room reminded him how much his life was built on appearances. Eduardo remembered his mother. He recalled her holding his hand in childhood, saying love was the only true inheritance. The pain of losing her had been so strong that he chose to hide behind his wealth. But hearing Pedro at the auction made him realize he was wrong. That boy had rescued something he thought was lost, the capacity to feel. Hours passed, and he remained seated by the window. His reflection in the glass showed a man aged by loneliness, despite being surrounded by riches. "What is all this worth if I have no one to share it with?" he murmured. The memory of Pedro defending the painting made him question his choices in a way that was painful yet also freeing. That night, Eduardo made a final decision. He no longer wanted to be remembered only as the arrogant billionaire. He wanted his wealth to have meaning, to be used for something greater than feeding his ego. He thought of his mother and how proud she would be if he finally did something of human value.
Carlos, in his simple home, was also reflecting. He was wary of Eduardo's proposal, but he couldn't ignore the sincerity he had seen in the man's eyes. He knew accepting could be risky, but it could also open doors to transforming lives. Still, he worried it might just be another passing whim of a rich man.
Pedro, on the other hand, didn't share that distrust. For him, the truth was simple. The man who had humiliated them was changing. "I think he kept remembering his own mom, Dad," he said at bedtime. Carlos smiled at his son's innocence, but recognized the wisdom in that childlike perception. While Pedro slept peacefully, Carlos lay awake thinking about his wife. If she were there, would she have believed the proposal? Would she have accepted seeing her memory become the foundation for a charity? His heart was full of doubts, but also of hope.
Eduardo and Carlos, in such different worlds, spent the night lost in similar reflections. Deep down, they both understood they were facing an opportunity for transformation, and that the decision they would make could change not only their own lives, but the lives of many others. The next morning, Eduardo sent a driver to Carlos's house with a formal invitation. It wasn't a cold official letter, but a personal request. He wanted Carlos and Pedro to come to his office to discuss the foundation project. Carlos hesitated, but decided to accept. He knew he needed to hear more before making a decision. Pedro was excited. "Are we going to see that man again, Dad?" he asked, holding the letter. Carlos nodded, but urged caution. "Yes, son, but let's take it slow. We still need to understand what he really wants." The boy smiled, confident. "I think he wants to do good, Dad." On the way to Eduardo's luxurious building, Carlos felt out of place. He was wearing his best simple clothes, but still felt small against the grandeur of the city. Pedro, however, walked with curiosity, admiring the tall buildings and expensive cars. The contrast between father and son reflected the tension of the moment. When they arrived, they were received with respect. Unlike the night of the auction, there were no looks of contempt, only consideration. The driver led them to a spacious meeting room with large windows overlooking the city. In the center, a simple, unostentatious table awaited them. Eduardo entered shortly after, without his usual pomp. He was dressed in elegant but understated clothes. His expression was serious, but not arrogant. He greeted Carlos with a firm handshake and, surprising them both, knelt down to greet Pedro at eye level. "You taught me the most important lesson of my life," he said with sincerity. Pedro smiled shyly, hiding behind his father. Carlos watched everything cautiously, but was beginning to see the genuine change in the man. Eduardo then laid out his plan. He wanted to create an art foundation open to everyone, especially artists who had never had a voice, like Carlos's wife.
"I want this foundation to carry her name," Eduardo explained, "and I want you, Carlos, to lead this project. You understand what true value means, and I want that to guide every step." The words were firm, yet filled with emotion. Carlos remained silent for a few moments. He had never imagined a billionaire would offer something so significant in his wife's name. He felt honored, but also pressured. Was he capable of handling such responsibility? What if it was all just an illusion? Pedro broke the silence. "Dad, Mom would have liked this. She always said art was for everyone, not just for rich people." The boy's simple words filled the room with an undeniable truth. Carlos took a deep breath and realized that this might be the opportunity to transform their pain into hope. Eduardo watched quietly, respecting the time needed for the decision. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't trying to control anything. He simply waited with the humility of someone who knew he was facing something far greater than money. Carlos remained silent for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. He felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, as if he were carrying not just his wife's memory, but the future of something much larger. Eduardo waited, his eyes fixed on Carlos, without his usual arrogance, only with the expectation of someone seeking forgiveness. "This is a very big proposal, Eduardo," Carlos said finally. His voice was steady, but filled with caution. "I don't know if I'm the right man for this. I'm just an ordinary person, trying to survive and raise my son. I have no experience managing foundations or big projects." Eduardo responded without hesitation. "That's exactly why I want you, because ordinary people know what truly matters. You carry something that many of those collectors will never understand: authenticity. And that's what the world needs." His words didn't sound like flattery, but like a sincere confession. Pedro, sitting beside his father, couldn't contain his excitement. "Dad, Mom would have loved this. We could help other people show their paintings too, just like she wanted." The boy's innocence brought tears to Carlos's eyes. It was as if his wife were speaking through their son. Carlos took a deep breath, wrestling with his emotions. The memory of his wife, her afternoons spent painting and dreaming of a fairer world, filled his mind. He wondered what she would say if she were there. And in his heart, he felt the answer was already clear. "I accept," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "But I don't want this to be just a project to ease your conscience. I want it to be something real, something that makes a difference. I want my wife's memory to live in every detail of this foundation." Eduardo nodded firmly. "That's exactly the idea. I don't just want to clean up Beth's mistakes. I want to build something that truly transforms the future." He then extended his hand, and Carlos shook it firmly. The gesture sealed a pact not of business, but of shared humanity.
Pedro smiled with relief. "So, does that mean Mom is getting an art center all her own?" Eduardo laughed for the first time, a sincere laugh, free of any irony. "Yes, Pedro, and it will be a home for everyone, a place where no one will ever laugh at a painting made with love." The meeting ended with the feeling that a new journey had begun. Carlos left the building, still in disbelief at what he had just agreed to, but deep down he felt hope blooming again. Pedro skipped along beside him, as if he already knew this would be the fresh start their lives needed. In the days that followed, Carlos began working alongside Eduardo to create the foundation. At first, he felt out of place, but he soon realized that his simplicity was exactly what gave the project its heart. Eduardo, once so arrogant, now listened carefully to every suggestion. Pedro often came along with his father, fascinated by the space taking shape. "One day I want to hang my painting here," he said, and Carlos smiled, imagining how proud his wife would be. Eduardo watched quietly, feeling inspired by the boy's pure heart and by Carlos's quiet dignity. The foundation was taking shape not as a symbol of wealth, but as a home for overlooked artists. For the first time in years, Eduardo felt his fortune had a real purpose, and Carlos, despite his doubts, could see he was building something far bigger than himself. On opening day, people from all walks of life filled the space. Carlos gave the opening speech. "This foundation was born from love, not money. It is proof that true art comes from the heart." His words moved the audience deeply. Beaming, Pedro showed a drawing he had made, his family united under a starry sky. The picture was hung as the first piece in the exhibition, drawing applause and tears. Carlos hugged his son and whispered, "Your mother's heart is right here." Eduardo, deeply moved, finally understood what money could never buy: meaning. The foundation became a beacon of hope, and the painting, once called trash, became an everlasting legacy of love. This painting was once called trash, but it was transformed into an eternal legacy of love. And here on this channel, every story carries a lesson that can change lives. Subscribe now and join this family of hearts who believe that love is worth more than any fortune.